So today we're talking about figured bass symbols and their uses. When I was an undergraduate, I absolutely hated figured bass. I didn't see the point of it. I was a modern composer and I was writing modern music. Why do I need to pay attention to these Baroque symbols? And then as I learned more, I realized how important they actually are for the analysis of music and for understanding where music came from. If you want to write music of the future, you really need to understand where the music of the past came from, right? So understanding how music developed from counterpoint to music theory to this concept that we have these chords and these triads that we can use and that function in a particular way is really important. And figured bass is part of that history. Today, what we're going to be talking about is just our figured bass symbols. It's going to be a pretty short lecture. So we have our triads. We've already talked about the various ways that we can identify our triads. But there's another way we can do it too. They can be identified using a numbering system that indicates the inversion of the triad. So if you look at this first chord, we've got the notes C, E, and G. So that 5 indicates that the G is a fifth above the root, the bottom note in the chord. And you can hear that perfect fifth. The 3 indicates that the E is a third above the root. So typically they're not going to write 5/3, they just won't write anything at all if you're going to create figured bass numbers. Now, the way that figured bass worked in the Baroque period is you'd have a bass line and then you'd have these figured bass numbers underneath it. And the figured bass numbers underneath would indicate to you, or the keyboardist, the actual triad to play. So you're kind of going back in history here and learning how this was done in a traditional way. So if we look at the second chord, you'll notice that the top number is a 6. Well, from E to C is a 6. And we always use the key to identify these numerical values. So for example, we're in the key of C here. There are no sharps or flats. So that means a 6 above E is going to be natural, so I'm going to play a C natural. If I was in the key of C sharp, we'd have to play, C sharp, we'd actually have to play a C sharp here. And then the E would be changed as well unless we were in C minor. So the 6 indicates to play a 6 above the E. The G still indicates to play a third above the bass note. So if you were playing a Baroque piece and you just had a bass line and they wrote 6/3 under the bass note, that would tell you that you are actually playing a first inversion triad. How you voice it is up to you. You could voice it in closed position like you have here, or you could take that G, which would be right here, and you could move it all the way up the octave, and then you could play your C here. So the voicing was up to the keyboardist. The last inversion is 6/4. So you notice there is a 6 interval of a 6 between the bass note, the G, and that E on top. It's an NBC thing. And then you hear a fourth between the bass note and the next note. So G and C. So here's your fourth, and here's your 6. So those are the 3 main figured bass symbols, and then they can be modified in various ways. But notice how 2 of these chords have a 6 as a top number, but none of them include 5 for the bottom number. So what does that mean? Since there's only one 5/3 chord, the numbers are typically left out. So we don't write 5/3 to indicate a root position triad. We just have a bass note, and the keyboardist knows that you need to stack the triads, the triad in thirds. So if you have a C in the bass, then I know as a keyboardist I have to write an E and a G. I have to play that in order to create the chord that's implied there. Since there are 2 chords with a 6, we try and make this as simple as possible and remove any redundant information. So we keep the 4 for the 6/4. So if you see a 6/4, it indicates that you should have a fourth in the bass followed by a third. But the 6 still indicates a 6/3. It's just that 3 is extra information that we don't need. So we cut out that 3, and the way you'll actually see your figured bass is the way it's written here. So 5/3 will be removed. There will be no numbers. You just see a bass note. And you'll know to play a triad that's based on thirds there. So C, E, and G. For the first inversion, you know there's still a 3 underneath it. It's implied. So we just end up playing E, G, and C for the 6-3. For the 6-4, we end up going up to the G here, and then we have C and E. So these are your inversions. This is the way it's written. So if you ever see in music, you've got maybe a Roman numeral 1, that would indicate root position. If you have a Roman numeral 1 with a 6 after it, that would indicate first inversion. If you have Roman numeral 1 with a 6-4, very uncommon in tonal music, it's usually employed as part of some other device, then we'd call it a 1-6-4. So those are your inversions, and this is how we basically do figured bass. But then, of course, it gets a little more complicated. So these are the most common figured bass symbols that are used. So the following symbols refer to specific intervals above the bass and indicate that the musician should raise or lower the pitch of a note by a half step. In some cases, you may actually just keep it natural. So if you see a sharp, a flat, or a natural, if you look at measures 1, here there's a sharp, here there's a flat, and here there's a natural. When these accidentals are all by themselves, they refer to the note that is a third above the bass. So this G here would mean you'd have to have a B natural, because in the key, the B natural here would actually be B flat. So when you sharp it, when you raise it a half step, that B flat becomes a B natural. So even though there's a sharp in the bass, we're going to use a natural here because this sharp just indicates to go up by 1 half step. So here, the F, we've got a flat in the bass, in the figured bass, so we know that we need to affect the third above the bass note. So we have an F here, here's an A flat. It would be A natural in the key signature, but we have to make it flat because of the figured bass. And then that ends up giving us a minor sonority. So if we look at the third one, here we're in C minor. So we have a C, an E, and a G. So what we need to do is make that E natural because there's an E flat in the key. So this natural here is indicating that the third of this chord is raised, which gives us a major sonority. If we look at the next two, they're a little bit different. So if you see a sharp underneath a number, it refers to the third above the bass note. It still refers to the third above the bass note, and it indicates a first inversion triad when there is a 6 as the top number. So what you see here is G, if you count up a 6, G, A, B, C, D, E. In the key, that's going to be an E flat. So we have a G to an E flat. So you're still using that 6 to determine the interval above the bass. Since this is a first inversion triad, we have a G, so that 6 above the bass becomes a root of the triad. So we need to build a triad here. So we have E flat, G, and then B natural. This would actually be a very unusual chord in the classical period, but it's for illustrative purposes only. So from E flat to G, we got to make sure we have our third and it has to fit the key. And then the B natural, we are going to raise because the B natural is a third above the G. So the 6 refers to essentially the position, the inversion of the triad, and then the number below it always refers to the third. All right, so the last one, a number with a slash through it, indicates the 6 above the bass should be raised. So in this case, D is a bass note, so a 6 above D is a B, and the key would be a B flat, but we just have to raise it up to a B natural. So that's all there is to it. So this is how you identified your figure bass symbols. If you have any questions, please post a comment below. I will do my best to answer them.